Welcome to another edition of the Best Business Minds, where we interview business leaders and academics that write thought-provoking books. I'm Marc Kramer, a serial entrepreneur who consults with family businesses and entrepreneurs. This is our 139th show. Today's guest is Navy SEAL and leadership expert Rich Diviney, author of The Attributes. Rich, welcome.
Thank you, Mark. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, no, thank you. And as I said, the book is great. And again, thank you for your service to country. We all very much appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate, and we appreciate the appreciation. So thank you.
It's a mutual admiration society. Thank you for serving, but please tell me about your professional history. You don't have to give details about the SEALs, but tell us about how you got to where you are now.
Yeah, of course. So I grew up wanting to be a Navy pilot. My twin brother and I, my dad was a private pilot, so we loved flying. And this was back in the early 80s. So this was pre-Top Gun. We still Top Gun, when Top Gun came out, it just made us want to do it even more. But because it was an awesome movie. But we grew up kind of bent on Navy pilot. It was early 90s, the first Gulf War, that I learned about the Navy SEALs. And that's when I said, "Oh, these guys are pretty cool." Got myself to a NRTC program at Purdue, and ultimately, as I approached commissioning, said to myself, "Well, I kind of know I could be a pilot, but I don't want to wonder if I could be a SEAL." So I applied, got selected, and then in '96 went to SEAL training. And really, as we know, everything became very kinetic in 2001. I was an officer, so I was in leadership positions, platoon commander, troop commander, worked most of my career in one of our most specialized SEAL commands, did half of my career there, but while there also ran training and assessment for that command, was a commanding officer of a SEAL squadron, and retired in 2017 after just under 21 years. And then after retiring, got into the leadership culture space, which I thought was nice, but I've always been really fascinated by performance. And so that's why I wrote the book, and it was based on some of the work I did in the SEAL teams. I'm really interested in this idea of performance, and of course wrote that and published it in January 2021. And the last 2 years been building a business with my wife around these concepts and consulting around performance and hiring and selection and really high performing teams and individuals.
And the book is great about that. And anybody who's going to try to build, especially entrepreneurs, it's a must-read book for sure. What was the hardest part about being a SEAL, and what did you like most and least about it?
Hardest part about being a SEAL. I mean, I'm gonna just to get real, I guess, brutally honest. It's losing people. That's the hardest part. Is that you're in a profession where, unfortunately, you have friends who are taken from you too early. War sucks, and it sucks for everybody. And it should be, most of us who've been there and done that are all somewhat pacifists at this point. And not in saying in the way that we understand that there are bad people out there who need to be addressed, but we also know that things like war and conflict have to be very deeply thought through and considered prior to doing it, because it's a horrible scene. So I think that's what I like the least. What I like the most was the humor. I mean, I tell you what, humor is one of the foundational elements. I talk about that in the book as a foundational.
Yeah, I have it as a question.
Yeah, for high performing teams. But the times I look back that we were joking around and laughing when the environment around us was probably the most miserable you could imagine, and we were laughing so hard we were crying. That's the times I love the most, and that's probably what I miss the most, is that type of bonding and camaraderie. And when I get together with my buddies who I served with, in fact, I just had coffee with one of them this morning. You just get it back. I mean, you just start joking around in ways that you just otherwise wouldn't with other people. All right, so that was probably my favorite part.
And have you worked for any corporation since you left the SEALs? Like, did you go into the private sector?
So I worked for a company called Barry Waymiller Leadership Institute. They're actually a manufacturing company out of St. Louis, but they have a leadership institute arm that I worked for about a year. Just kind of cutting my teeth in the speaking space and the teaching space, which I hadn't done a lot of, and I didn't like standing in front of people and talking, which meant, of course, I said, well, I have to conquer that fear and do it more often. So I did that for about a year, and then pulled out of that to become an independent contractor, really because I love leadership and culture, but I really wanted to focus on performance. And of course, for me, this idea of performance and this elemental performance, there's leadership and culture is in there, obviously, because leadership is about performance, right? But that's the lane I wanted to go. So I would say about a year working for somebody, and since then I've worked for myself.
Yeah, well, you guys are natural entrepreneurs. I mean, you're raised to be natural entrepreneurs.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's that mentality.
What makes the SEALs unique?
So it's really what I defined. It's kind of, if I were to tell you what I'm totally into now and what I'm focused on in my post Navy career, it's how I defined the SEALs even when I was in the teams. And I used to say, hey, it's not about the shooting, it's not about the skydiving, it's not about all the stuff you see on TV. Navy SEALs are masters of uncertainty. We are individuals and teams that can drop into complex environments and perform. And so what I've been doing, what I'm fascinated with doing is helping others become masters of uncertainty. The attributes is just the first step. In fact, the book I'm beginning to write will be called Masters of Uncertainty. And the journey we take clients on with our company is a Masters of Uncertainty journey. But that's what makes SEALs unique, is that they are individuals and teams that can drop into deeply complex environments and perform optimally. And that's how we do what we do.
That sounds like the definition of an entrepreneur for sure.
Yeah.
Please define attributes as you wrote about in the book. And how many are there?
Yeah. So
I mean, over 20, I think.
Well, there's more than that. I wrote about 25 in the book.
Yeah.
There's more than 25, right? But attributes, attributes are elements of performance that largely go unconsidered or get conflated with skills. And when I was running this assessment selection program at this very specialized command, I was tasked with, hey, you need to help us articulate what we're doing here. And what I had to do was I had to pull apart performance. A lot of times when we look at performance, we look at visible skills. And skills are, just kind of lay out the terms here, they are not inherent to our nature. None of us are born with the ability to ride a bike or throw a ball. Skills direct our behavior in known and specific environments. So here's how and when to throw a ball or ride a bike. And then because they're highly visible, they're very easy to assess, measure, and test. And you can put scores around them and stats around them. You can put them on resumes, which is exactly why we get seduced by skills often when we're picking teams. But what skills don't tell us is how we're going to show up in stress, challenge, and uncertainty, because in an unknown environment, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to apply a known skill. This is when we lean on our attributes, okay? Attributes, on the other hand, are inherent to our nature. All of us are born with levels of patience, situation awareness, adaptability, resilience, okay? We can develop those things over time and experience, of course, but you can see levels of this stuff in very small children, which means there's a nature-nurture element to attributes. Attributes don't direct behaviors. Attributes inform behavior. So in other words, they tell us how we're going to show up to an environment. My son's levels, for example, of perseverance and resilience informed the way he showed up when he was learning the skill of riding a bike, and he was falling off a dozen times doing so. And then finally, because they're hidden in the background, they're very difficult to assess, measure, and test. They're hard to see. They are the most visible and visceral during times of stress, challenge, and uncertainty when skills can't be applied. But if we're looking at performance in any endeavor in life, business, personal, whatever, but especially hiring and picking teams, if we're missing out on attributes, we're missing out of a huge part of the performance picture, especially if you want to build a team that operates well in uncertainty. And I'll just give you one story to kind of exemplify this that comes from the SEALs. So back when I went through training back in '96, one of the first things you had to do when you got there was swim 50 meters. So you had to jump into a pool, swim 25 to one end, swim 25 to the other end, standard swim test. The story goes, this happened apparently before I got there, but the story goes that this kid shows up. It's his turn to swim. When he jumps into the pool, he sinks right to the bottom, and he starts walking across the bottom of the pool to one side, and then he walks across the bottom of the pool back to the other side. He comes up and he's gasping for air, nearly drowning. And the instructor looks at him and says, "What the heck are you doing?" And the kid, who's still trying to get his breath, looks at the instructor and says, "I'm sorry, instructor, I don't know how to swim." At that point, the instructor looks at him, takes a pause, and says, "That's okay, we can teach you how to swim." Now, why did the instructor say that? The instructor said that because he knew that if this kid had the attributes, the qualities that allowed him to show up to Navy SEAL training without knowing how to swim, he had everything inside of him that we needed for him to be a Navy SEAL. Teaching him the skill of swimming was going to be the easy part, right? So these attributes have to be considered in performance, but especially if you want to build teams that operate in stress, challenge, and uncertainty, and specifically masters of uncertainty.
So we have a question from the audience. What was the trigger point in your mind to become a SEAL after not wondering about it for years? How would you compare yourself to fellow SEAL, the Beast, David Goggins?
David Goggins, yeah. Thanks, Tom. That's a good question. David and I know each other. I know David. We served together once. In fact, he and I saw each other right before he released his well, not, I guess he just released his new book, but his last book, Can't Hurt Me. And we talked about this. So let me take this one at a time. Trigger point to become a SEAL was this idea that I didn't want to wonder if I could. I knew I could be a pilot, but I didn't want to wonder if I could. So I just said I'm gonna try it and see if I can. So that was really the trigger point. And then of course now you go down a road. So David is a very interesting dude, and I wouldn't compare myself to him because he is a beast. He's a physical beast. One of the things one of the things about David, and he and I talked about this, is a lot of his lessons, his testing himself comes from this physical world. He puts himself into physical environments to test himself, and while that's really helpful and can be a great way to test oneself. It's different than, say, combat. It's different than going through an experience, building a business. It's different than going through an illness like cancer. There's a different level of managing and performing in uncertainty that physical endeavors don't give you. And so I think one of the reasons why I love David and I love what he does is he's incredibly authentic. Okay, so and through his authenticity, he's inspiring. And then because of what he does, he's able to inspire people in walks of life that never might have been inspired, like inner city and things like that. People say, "Hey, he's like, "Hey, just get through it. I can do this." Right? I love that stuff. I think where I enjoy breaking off is saying, "Hey, okay, look at this stuff now. Let's go a little bit deeper and let's see how we can apply some of what David talks about in terms of this mental game to experiences that aren't in fact physical, right? Then that are like really they're truly mental. They're emotional. They're organizational. They are life in all terms. And so I think I don't compare myself to guys like David or even Jocko. I think what they do is phenomenal. And what I try to do is say, okay, based on what they do, because they do it so well, how can I create something that can be additive or help someone go a little bit deeper? And that's kind of my thought. So thanks for the question, though, Tom.
You start your chapter on leadership writing that leadership is not a position, but a behavior. Please explain that. And from your experience, are leaders born or can anyone be taught to lead?
Yeah. All right. So leadership. So we often get being in charge and being a leader conflated. Okay. They are not the same thing. One is a position and one is a behavior. Okay. And the reason is because, and here's the other bad news. While you get to self-designate as being in charge, you don't get to self-designate as a leader. You don't get to call yourself a leader. That'd be like calling yourself good looking or funny. Other people decide whether or not you're good looking or funny. Other people decide whether or not you're a leader, and they do so based on the way you behave. Okay. These behaviors are what actually causes people to say, that is someone who I want to follow. Now, a lot of us may have had this experience. Okay. I know I did in the military, where the person who is in a hierarchical position above me, I look at and I say, I wouldn't follow that person anywhere. Meanwhile, there's someone over here by the water cooler who has no hierarchical position whatsoever, and I say, I would follow that person to hell and back. It's because of the way we behave, right? So to be a leader, you have to behave like a leader. And if you think you're a leader and you look back and there's no one following you, I got bad news for you, okay? You might be in charge, but you're not a leader. So in terms of the second part of the question, are leaders born or are they made? I say they are neither. They are chosen. Okay. Leaders are chosen by the people who say, I want to follow. And it's based on these behaviors. So if you're someone who is in charge, that's great. If you want to be a leader, you have to behave in a way that leaders do. And I have the 5 attributes. Most of these behaviors, by the way, stem from these core attributes. And I talk about 5 of them in the book. But if you behave this way, people will say, generally, that is someone I want to follow.
Is there any leader that we see every day that you say, man, that person, he or she, and it doesn't matter what country or what line of work, do you say, I'm really impressed with their ability to lead?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think because it's a choice and a decision, it's highly subjective to the individual. All of us have different people who we look at and say, that is someone I would want to follow. I mean, sure, there's probably more ubiquitous examples out there, certainly in history, Abe Lincoln, Winston Churchill. I think there's always some people who a lot of people, the majority of people say, that person behaves in a way, but when it comes to who we individually subjectively choose, I mean, we all know this. In fact, our politics, as divisive as it is now, is a good descriptor. I mean, there are people on the right who consider certain people leaders, while people on the left say, no, I would never follow that person, and vice versa, right? So it becomes a subjective task. I think, though, it's different than someone, again, just being in a position of hierarchy or being in a position of power or even fame. It's how really that person behaves, right? And I think the truest leaders in our lives personally are the ones who we have contact with, and the ones who behave in a way with us that we're like, yes, I would follow that person. That is someone who I look up to, I would follow, and I can consider them a mentor.
Yeah, it's funny. Staying away from the politics, I had a leadership expert who written a book on this show, and he said President Trump is not a leader; he's an influencer. And he said there's a difference, and then he gave his difference. Of course, you might look at President Trump and say, I think he is a leader because of whatever he does. But I thought it was interesting that they felt he was more of an influencer than a leader.
Yeah.
Another question from the audience. You're touching on coaching. How do you test and determine if someone is coachable? What is the point where it becomes an impossible task to be successful?
Yeah. Well, yeah, thanks for the question, Jim. So coachable, again, we have to ask ourselves, okay, what is the environment inside of which we're asking this person to perform? That will start to dictate to us whether or not this is a insurmountable task, or at least a task that we don't have enough time or effort to embark upon. This is why I love attributes. Attributes as individuals start to inform how we show up to the game, right? And so let me just give you a quick example. I think so. Okay, first of all, I'll back up here. All of the attributes, when we talk about attributes, all of us as human beings are born with all of the attributes. Okay, the difference in each one of us are the levels to which we have each attribute. So I usually use adaptability. Take adaptability. 10 being high and 1 being low. I would be about a level 8 on adaptability. That means when the environment changes around me outside of my control, it's fairly easy for me to go with the flow and roll with it, okay? Someone else might be a level 3 on adaptability. The same thing happens to them. It's difficult for them to go with the flow, okay? Again, there's no judgment on, well, if we were to line up all these attributes on the wall like dimmer switches, all of us would have different settings, okay? And that informs our performance. And there's no judgment there because it's like judging our hair color. It's like who we are. I like to think of it in the way the movie Cars just describes it. I love the movie Cars, okay? It's not just because my kids made me watch it 1,000 times. It's a good movie. But I think it's a good example of us as humans. All of us are cars, okay? But some of us are Jeeps, some of us are SUVs, some of us are Ferraris. And there's no judgment there because the Ferrari can do things the Jeep can't do, and the Jeep can do things the Ferrari can't do, okay? But we have to lift our hood and figure out what kind of car we are, because we may be a Jeep that's trying to run on a Ferrari track, or we might be a Ferrari that's trying to run on a Jeep track. So when it comes to coachable and coachability, one of the questions that we as leaders have to ask ourselves is, why is this person not performing? Perhaps I'm asking a Jeep to be a Ferrari, right? I mean, I've had this. When I was commanding officer, I had, obviously I was in charge of a bunch of people. I had a supply department, and I had about 8 people in that department, four of whom were kind of in the kind of futures, the acquisition type stuff, and the other 4 were in like the administrative, accountable or logging type stuff, right? Keeping track of everything. And I had one sailor who was underperforming, and when I brought her in to kind of talk about it, what I immediately realized within about 5 minutes of conversation is that person was in the futures section, and the attributes that she brought to the table were completely more congruent with the other section. All I did was shift her, and her performance skyrocketed, right? So part of our job as leaders and coaching is to ask ourselves, is this person in the right position in the first place? And then say, okay, if the answer is yes, then go about saying, okay, what are those specific things that we need to try to coach on? And then it's your decision as a leader to say, how long and how much effort do we have? How much time do we have to put effort into this, right? And the SEAL teams that I was part of, if someone didn't have a predominance of the attributes we were looking for, unfortunately, we didn't have time to train people. We didn't have time to bring people up to the game. We were moving too fast, okay? But that's not the case in every organization. You might have someone who's just out of college, and you're like, this person is showing a lot of potential. They have a bunch of the attributes. They need a couple more. Let's spend some time on this person. Let's develop this person. That's all part of the hard job of leadership.
You explain what it takes to be high-functioning team in the SEALs. Please explain how you prepare for this. And is it more mental than physical?
100%. It's high performance is I would say 99% mental, because even physical performance is 99% mental, right? It all starts in the brain, and I think the high functionality that you find in the SEAL teams or any kind of high performing unit is this idea that we can actually process our environment in very rapid and precise ways. And so I talk about the mental acuity attributes in the book. those mental acuity attributes are the most important for high performance. They really are, because it all starts in the brain. And are we situation aware enough to understand our environment to the extent that we need to? Can we compartmentalize to the extent that we can prioritize immediately and we can focus on what we need to focus on in the moment and block out everything else and then shift when we need to? Can we task switch? In other words, can we shift our priorities in a very smooth, efficient manner? Because again, we can only focus on one thing at a time, our brains at least. And then how fast can we learn that, metabolize that, so we're not making the same mistakes every time, right? And so to the extent that those attributes are higher, you start to get into the higher performing teams. Of course, depending on the team you're looking at, but certainly in the SEAL teams, those mental acuity attributes came into play to a large extent.
In the book, you read about a program that picked the best of the best SEALs, and half of those flunked out of the program. Why did that happen, and what did you learn from it?
Yeah, so that was the assessment selection. So this particular command, what happened was we would get applicants from the regular SEAL teams and they had to have a lot of experience. So you had to have been a SEAL for 5 years or longer, right? You had to have top evaluations and fitness reports, and you had to be kind of recommended. And so top dudes, and they were coming to our program, and we had a 9-month process that we put them through. A 9-month kind of, we called it BUDS too, but it was 9 month, and 50% were flunking. I would say flunking. They weren't making it through the program. And one of the problems we had when I took over was we weren't able to effectively articulate why guys were not making it, because either the top guys, we were saying things like, wow, they couldn't shoot very well, they couldn't do this very well, all very skills based. It didn't make sense because these guys were all top dudes, right? And so I was tasked with, hey, Rich, you need to articulate this better. This is when I began to dissect attributes and skills, because what I recognized was that, hey, wait a second, it wasn't about us looking for specific skills in this program. Just like basic SEAL training, BUDS is not about looking for specific skills. We were looking for specific attributes, and the environments that looked like it was skills training was in fact attribute assessments, right? We were seeing if the guys could actually operate in this environment and had the attributes to be able to do what we needed them to do. And so that's really what I learned the most about that program, and really, I mean, kind of the impetus of obviously everything I'm into now and the whole book.
And by the way, you guys are in high stress environments. How do you keep from burning out? Like, how long does somebody actually end up lasting in the SEALs? You know, like in professional football, it's like a 4 years, I think, is the average, or 3 years.
Yeah.
And you even see guys who have the talent dropping out of the NFL for a variety of reasons. Yeah. So how does that work in that environment, a high stress environment? How do you keep people resilient and not burning out?
Yeah.
Especially seeing what you see.
Yeah, I mean, burnout still happens. It just happens over a longer period of time. I think if you're not careful, I will answer that because it's a really large question. But the way I'll answer it is really to help define performance the way we look at it, and the way that all high performing teams and masters of uncertainty look at performance. And it's not peak performance. We're kind of in this. We've been in this mode for several years about everybody wants to have peak performance. It's peak here, peak there, peak. Peak is the word of the day, right? And people used to say to me, "Hey, you Navy SEALs, you're the ultimate peak performers." And I used to disagree with them, because peak, by definition, is an apex, and there's only one place you can go from an apex, and that's down, right? And then peak also has to be usually scheduled and planned for and prepared for. The professional athlete, the professional football player, plans and schedules his entire week so that he can peak for 3 hours on Sunday. Okay, we don't get to do that, right? The SEALs don't, and normal people don't. Okay, so what we define it as, what I would define it as, and have been, is optimal performance. Optimal performance means that I'm going to do the best that I can in the moment, whatever the best looks like in that moment. All right. Sometimes our best looks like peak. It's flow states, everything's clicking, everything's awesome and groovy, okay? Sometimes our best is I am just head down, nugging it out, going step by step, because that's all I have right now. And it's dirty, and it's gritty, and it's painful, and it's hard. That is still performing optimally, right? So optimal performance allows us a couple things. It allows us to pat ourselves on the back when we are just gutting it out and grinding it out, because that is still performing optimally, right? But also, more importantly, it allows us to do what I call kind of proper energy management. In other words, I don't have to be peak when I'm driving to the grocery store. Okay, I can manage my energy in ways. Here's another myth I'll bust about the Navy SEALs, because you see it on TV and movies. You might see a group of SEALs getting ready to do a mission, and they all get into a huddle and they start hoo-yawing and high-fiving like some athletic team about to take the field. It doesn't happen like that. It never happens, right? In fact, most of the times we were in helicopters going into a target and guys were asleep. They were napping. Why? Because we didn't know what was coming. We don't know how long we were going to be out there. We didn't know what we needed. We weren't going to waste an ounce of our energy on doing stupid stuff in the helicopter, right? We were going to save our energy. We're going to optimally perform. So optimal performance allows you, if you think of optimal performance as this umbrella underneath which peak can exist and grinding it out can exist and recovery can exist, all this exists, under this umbrella. And the way we delay burnout is we modulate our energy in the way we need to modulate throughout everything we're doing. That can mean even during a mission, right? There are phases even during a mission where things are slowed down and we're taking micro recovery moments depending on where you are. So I think that's kind of the key to a little bit more of the longevity.
Here's a question from the audience. What's one blind spot that you had going through the SEAL program? And from a company culture perspective, what's the biggest blind spot you see in working with clients?
Yeah, the biggest, I think the blind spot is this lack of understanding of what to look for if you're actually looking for the top performers, okay? Because skills are so easy to see, we get seduced by them. And the blind spot I see in organizations all the time, especially when we go in and help them, is that they are picking a lot of their hiring processes, a lot of their performance evaluation processes are centered around and built around skills, right? And you're not learning about a team if you're just looking at skills. So this is what I call in the book the dream team paradox. You build a team with all the people with the top skills, but they don't interconnect properly, right? So when the shit hits the fan, they fall apart, okay? If you want teams, so I always define teams as any group of 2 or more people that are bonded in, that are working together towards a common goal or objective, okay? That's a team. A high-performing team is any group of 2 or more people that are working together towards a common goal or objective that perform not only when things are going great, but also when things are going sideways, right? That is a high-performing team. And the only way you put together teams that do that properly is you look at attributes. And so when we go in, we start showing organizations, hey, and helping them understand the attributes you're looking for, it's like taking the blinders off. And now they have ways to save money on bad hires. They have ways to performance evaluate in ways that they never considered. They start to look at performance in a whole different way. That's the blind spot, because if you want to build masters of uncertainty and teams like that, you have to look at attributes.
Another question from the audience. In 2017, I attended a keynote presentation by Robert O'Neill and a member of the SEAL Team 6 mission involving Osama bin Laden. He said a SEAL's #1 leadership trait is that they never quit, which is also an important trait for entrepreneurs. How important is never quitting in being a Navy SEAL or a successful entrepreneur?
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Chuck. So Rob is a great friend of mine. We served together. I'm not sure if you read his book.
I did.
Operator,
yeah.
But Commander Rich, that's me. So we deployed, when he talks about Commander Rich, that's me. We deployed together. In fact, I talked to him just last week. He's a great friend. However, I would disagree slightly on what he says. And it's not because what he says is wrong. It's because never quitting comes with this definitiveness and almost a stigma. And the way I would describe this, in fact, I wrote an article recently, and what I titled I titled it, "It's okay to quit, just never give up." Okay. And I actually give an example of a mission that we turned around on, that I had to turn everybody around. Rob was on that with me. In fact, Rob was on a couple of missions that I had to turn around, where this idea of quitting, quitting is, we can think of it as kind of a very definitive, singular, in the moment act, right? And it's kind of done and it's over with, and it's kind of like you're quitting, like it's done, right? It's singular. Giving up is like you're giving up on like a whole goal. So the examples will be like, I can quit today's workout, right? But I'm not going to give up on being healthy, okay? And the idea is, in any goal or endeavor, right, we're going to go down a pathway, and that pathway is going to be unknown in certain parts, and we're going to think we should go one direction, but ultimately we're like, oh shoot, that's not working. And if we're not smart enough to manage our environment and understand and keep on interrogating whether or not what we're doing is working, then we're going to fail. And sometimes when we interrogate whether or not what is working, we say, this is not working. we're going to quit what we're doing and we're going to try something else. Okay. And this is my example that I write about in the blog, that we were on the mission. And as we were going down this mission planning and then starting to go out there, things were just coming at me and coming at us that I was like, this is not right. This is not fitting. And finally got to the point where it was, okay, there's just too much here. This doesn't feel right. We're going to quit this, right? And it didn't. Again, we could say we returned to base. You could say we lived to fight another day. We can wrap whatever words you want around that. We quit the op, and that's what it felt like, right? But I knew it was the right thing to do, even though it felt bad, right? So we quit. We went back. We regrouped. We figured it out, and we did something else the next day, right? So quitting is okay as long as you never give up. So I would almost just modify is you never give up. That's one key trait of all Navy SEALs, and I think Rob would agree with it. I'll text him after this and make sure he does.
Another question from the audience: is there a way to prioritize attributes most to least important, or is it a situational dependent?
Yeah, it's both situationally dependent and kind of organizationally and team dependent. So, for example. And this is exactly what we do with teams and organizations. We help them figure out what the top attributes are for their team and organization. So, because that list is going to look different depending on who you are. In other words, the list of attributes required to be a great Navy SEAL team is going to look different than the list of attributes required to be a great sales team or a great surgical team or a car sale or a carpentry team. Whatever you name it, that list is different. It's subjective to that. So we can do the work there and basically figure out what that master list is and absolutely prioritize what we think those top attributes are based on the process we go through. So you say, hey, when we're doing this thing, the top 3 attributes are this, this, and this. No compromise, nothing. If every member doesn't have these, they just can't be a part of this thing, right? And then it goes down in priority in terms of the way we do the process. So the answer is yes, you can prioritize them. There's a process and a system we take organizations through to do that. And once you prioritize them and organize them that way, now you know exactly what the absolutes are and the things you can kind of waver on.
By the way, I want to mention that Chuck buys every single book of everybody's ever been on this show. So his library is pretty extensive, and I'm sure he'll be adding your book as well. SEALs seem to require the same traits as entrepreneurs as we've talked about throughout this conversation. Mm-hmm. One of the most important is adaptability, and you talk about that all the time. What kind of mental makeup do you need to be adaptable, and can anyone become really good at it?
Well, you need some of that attribute. Can anyone become really? I don't know if anybody can become really good at it. We can all do better on our adaptability. But again, adaptability is this idea of how comfortable are you when the environment forces you to change. What's that comfort level? If it's a low comfort level, you're likely low on adaptability. It doesn't mean you're not adaptable. It just means you're a little bit lower, and you can work on becoming more comfortable adapting. And the way you do that is you continuously throw yourself into environments that force you to adapt. That's how you do it. So the answer is yes, you can develop it. Sometimes a balance of other attributes, though, can also help it. So in other words, I've coached and talked to people who are low on adaptability, but high on open-mindedness, right? That basically helps cancel that low adaptability out, because when you're high on open-mindedness, the environment's changing. Yeah, it's slightly uncomfortable, but your mindset is, well, let me keep an open mind and see what happens, right? So high open-mindedness and low adaptability can actually help. In other words, high open-mindedness can help cancel out a little bit of low adaptability, but you can certainly, any one of these attributes you can actually develop if you're low on it. It just takes 3 things. It takes 1, an awareness that you need to develop it, 2, a willingness and a motivation to develop it, and then 3, a willingness to step deliberately into environments that test and tease that attribute out. So in other words, if you wanted to develop your patience, for example, you would have to go find environments that test and tease your patience. Okay, whatever that looks like for you. It might be you're going to go deliberately drive in traffic, or you're going to pick the longest line in the grocery store to stand in. I always say have kids. That'll develop your patience, right? But whatever those environments are for you subjectively, you have to find those. It's going to be uncomfortable. And it's going to be challenging, right? There's going to be uncertainty and stress and challenge involved, but that's the point, right? So any attribute you're a little bit lower on that you want to develop, you can develop that. One final note on that: just because you're low on an attribute doesn't mean you have to develop it. Okay. Again, we're automobiles and we have different attributes for reasons. There are certain niches in life where being higher on a specific attribute might be detrimental to what you're trying to do. I always say the stand-up comic who's too high on empathy is not going to be a very good stand-up comic, because they're not going to be able to find the funny at a funeral, right? The Navy SEAL, be honest with you, who's way too high on empathy, might not be able to do our job, right? So depending on the niche and the environment you're in, the type of automobile you are, just because you're low on an attribute doesn't mean you have to develop it. It's really say, hey, what in the context of what I'm doing or what I want to do, what are maybe the one or two attributes I'm a little bit lower on, and that working on will actually help me do better.
I would have loved to have just been on your team just to have these conversations. I just enjoy listening to you talk about that. You write about the power of humor, especially when things are going well. When is a good time to interject humor, and when should it, and what should it look like?
I'm of the opinion that it's never a bad time to interject humor, but the SEAL teams are we laugh at everything. That's a superpower. And here's why. When we laugh, we are juiced with three very powerful chemicals, neurotransmitters. One is dopamine. Okay, dopamine, we all know it's often mistaken as the reward chemical, right? It's actually more of a motivation chemical. It tells us this is good, keep doing this. But it's the root of all addictive behavior. Dopamine tells us, hey, this is good, keep doing this, right? So anyway, we get dopamine. We get endorphins. Endorphins are the human body's opiates. Okay, interestingly enough, late 60s, early 70s, doctors were studying the brains of drug addicts. And inside the human brain, they found opiate receptors. They're like, that's interesting. Why the heck does the human brain have opiate receptors? It's because we make our own opiates. They're called endorphins. We've often heard of this as runner's high, all right, or whatever. We get endorphins because we are designed as endurance creatures. We're designed to go the long haul to find food, shelter, whatever. Endorphins help us do that. So we get dopamine, we get endorphins, and finally we get oxytocin, known as the love hormone. Okay, it's more of a neurohormone, which means it affects both the body and the brain. Okay, but known as, it's a binding chemical, right? We get huge amounts of oxytocin when we engage in physical contact with other human beings or our pets. We get oxytocin when we either commit or even witness acts of kindness and generosity towards other human beings. So it bonds us and binds us. So think about this. When we laugh, an involuntary response, right, like sneezing, we automatically, without even wanting it, we get dopamine, we get endorphins, we get oxytocin. Those are hugely powerful feel-good chemicals, okay? And so they are actually hacking into the ability to perform in stress, challenge, uncertainty. Because, just take dopamine, for example, when we step into our fear, we also get rewarded with dopamine. Any of us can probably think of an example in our lives where we were genuinely frightened. We had some fear in ourselves and in our minds, okay? And someone cracks a joke or something makes us laugh, and suddenly our fear goes away. Okay, it's because we've just hacked into courage. We've gotten this dopamine hit. So I have never experienced a high-performing team that doesn't have humor as a large part of it. And I think the best teams. It's also, by the way, why sense of humor or humor is one of the most desired qualities when looking for a partner or a mate. Because if you can find someone who can help make you laugh or you can laugh with, it's a hack and to continue going. It's a hack to achieving. So that's why it's one of the most important attributes, and how it looks is subjective to the team. I mean, I'll be honest with you. The stuff that we would joke about in our SEAL team rooms. I mean, if they had cameras and microphones, all of us would be canceled within 2 seconds, right? But so it's going to be subjective to the group. But I tell you what, regardless, it's very, very powerful.
I guess Kevin Hart missed his calling. He should have been a Navy SEAL.
Yeah.
So we have a question from the audience. What can we do in our schools to have a higher impact on reaching optimal performance and helping people start off as square pegs in a round hole?
Yeah, what a great question, Tom. We've thought about this a lot. We've been approached by schools from colleges down to elementary. Colleges and high schools I'm not as concerned with, because I think the concepts in the book are sound and they can be absorbed. I get concerned when we're talking about younger kids, because from the ages of birth to about 22, okay, really 25, but we can say 20, 22, our frontal lobes are still forming, okay? We are absolute sponges. Our plasticity has never been higher, right? So I'm always of the mind that we don't want to label anybody, right? We want to throw as much in front of our kids' windshield so that they can figure out what shape peg they actually are, right? And let them figure that shape out. And then once their frontal lobe's nice and formed, then they can start figuring out, okay, where do I fit? Okay, but I do think that we've talked about this with schools. Our biggest thing was, I wanted to make sure, and we're going to work with schools. That's one of our goals, right? But again, I'm always reminded when, when you're building a business, I'm always reminded of the old Russian proverb, which is, if you chase two rabbits, both will escape, right? So you have to pick which rabbit to chase. And so we're chasing a rabbit so we can get ourselves established. At some point, I want to work with younger kids' schools, but it would be, how do we develop a system of education that can start understanding and being aware of this stuff, but really developing habits of introspection and habits of testing and risking, right? That's the biggest, I think, gift we can give to our kids is an ability to, and a desire to learn more about themselves and throw themselves into some discomfort so they can learn and grow and things like that. And so that's where we'd focus. That's where we will focus once we can chase that rabbit.
Question from the audience. Your thoughts on team are insightful and make a ton of sense. Given the new hybrid or remote environments many people and companies are in, how to ensure individuals work together? This definitely plays into adaptability, but overall not being present with one another presents some real challenges. How do you make that work? And that is a problem, because how do you build company culture and interaction with people if everybody's on Zoom?
Yeah, no, you're right. Well, Jim, the foundational element of any team, high performing or otherwise, but certainly high performing, is trust. Okay, and so it starts with trust. Now, trust, just like leadership, is based off behaviors. In other words, you cannot make anybody trust you. All you can do is behave in a way that allows them to choose to trust you. And those behaviors stem from these attributes. And are you being empathetic? Are you showing someone you care about them? Are you being accountable? Are you being authentic? Okay. You can actually start to express some of these attributes through a digital environment as well. I mean, listen, every Zoom call doesn't have to be all about business. I can get on a Zoom call and for the first 15 minutes say, hey, Mark, how are you doing? Tell me about your life. What's going on? How are you feeling? Tell me about this. How are your kids? We can start to genuinely create a relationship with each other that starts founding these elements of trust to a way that, oh my gosh, I really feel like this person cares about me. Trust begins to build, and from trust, from that foundational boat, if you will, you can then build higher and higher performance. But the key is, especially in a digital environment, find ways to build trust with each other in a digital environment. It's going to involve communicating with each other, spending time with each other. Listen, one of my good friends always says time is the currency of leadership. Okay, because time is something, no one has any more time than anybody else. It's all an equal commodity. And when we give our time to someone, we can't get it back. There's no giving that back, right? So when you spend time with another human being, they feel cared for. They feel like you're taking care of them. So spending time with your people, maybe some one-on-ones. I have friends who will they'll do virtual lunches with random, just one-on-one with someone at random times throughout the week, and just talk. Like, let's eat on camera, but let's talk about stuff and build some trust. So I think building trust is the key. And then now that we're kind of out of this COVID stuff, capitalize on opportunity to get together physically as well. That is hugely important. I'm not necessarily convinced that you can have a 100% digital team and have it be high performing. I think there has to be at least some occasions, maybe once or twice a year, where you can actually physically get with each other and hug it out, whatever, get that oxytocin flowing, right? In physical ways, right? So that's how I'd answer that.
I had a neuroscientist from Wharton on the show too, and he said that people need to get back together in offices, because without that personal interaction, you lose like 30% of your brain functionality that comes with interacting with humans in a physical and real environment, which I thought was really interesting. I'll have to introduce your son to him, since that's his area that he's interested in. You write about the importance of patience. Are some people just wired to be impatient, and how do you discipline yourself to be more patient? Because you see people who are just impatient.
So I talk about patience in the book as an attribute, but I do it in a chapter which I call the others, because what I found was, when I wrote about the 25, when I was looking at the 25, you'll notice that I have 5 categories: grit, mental acuity, drive, team ability, and leadership. Okay, but in those 5 categories, there are only 22 attributes. The other 3, or we could actually call them 6, I talk about in the chapter called the others. The reason why I set those apart was because they didn't share the same properties as the first 22. So in other words, adaptability, resilience, courage, situation awareness, one could argue that if you're a little bit higher on that, it's a better thing, right? Better option. So higher is a little bit better, not too high, but higher is a little bit better than lower. Okay, that could be argued. But when it comes to things like patience and impatience, or competitiveness and non-competitiveness, that same calculus doesn't exist. In other words, there are highly successful people who are both patient, and there are highly successful people who are impatient. There are highly successful people who are competitive. There are highly successful people who are not competitive, right? So in terms of patience as an attribute, nothing's wrong with being highly impatient, and nothing's wrong with being patient, right? So you have to figure out where you are. You just have to see if that's helping you in your endeavor. What I will say about success is I do think one of the keys to success is the ability to delay gratification. Okay, that is another level, or a different, almost a little offshoot of impatience that I think has to be, and maybe I haven't really thought too deeply, but maybe we just call it even something else. But the ability to delay gratification is, I think, essential to success, right? Because what that means is I'm going to do the hard work now, right? I'm willing to do the hard work. I'm willing to take the hits. I'm willing to take the lumps. I don't need the reward in the moment. I can work hard and get the reward later. I think that's the type of patience that's required for ultimate success. But in terms of attribute wise, being highly impatient or being highly patient, not a big deal. In fact, the most high performing teams have both polarities on it. My wife and I, I'll give my wife and I example. We're married for about 21 years now. We've lived the war together. Okay. She is an impatient person. Okay. That's just her attribute. I am a patient person. Now, that's worked beautifully in our relationship, because when patience is required, I typically step up and take lead. When impatience is required, she steps up and takes lead, right? And that's how we play the game. Okay, so we can come to these teams. Same with competitiveness and non-competitiveness. Same with the other one, fear of rejection versus I don't care what people think. Those are the three ones that actually, the polarities, having both polarities on a team, actually make for the highest performing teams.
On this line of patience, and then we'll get back to questions from the audience. When does too much patience as a leader negatively affect the organization? And how do you know when it's time to flick the switch?
Well, I would almost say
Like,
it's not necessarily too much patience, it's too little decisiveness. I think decisiveness and the inability to make decisions, the inability to actually move when you need to move, is actually what's going to affect an organization negatively. I would not argue that too much patience or too much impatience would affect it negatively. I think I mean, we could certainly make arguments. Nothing's absolute, right? But I would actually relate that to decisiveness. If a leader is unable to make effective decisions in an efficient manner, in a timely manner that makes sense, that is going to affect the organization. And by the way, it'll also erode the people's ability, the people's belief in their ability to lead. Decisiveness is a leadership attribute that I talk about, and it's a leadership attribute for a reason. Because, and this is different than making decisions. Making decisions is a skill. You can teach someone how to make better decisions, and there's a process by which you do it. Decisiveness adds efficiency and speed and timeliness to the process. And leaders, the best leaders, are decisive, not in a irresponsible way, but in a way that says, hey, I'm going to collect as much information as I can, but I'm not going to go overboard. I'm not going to have paralysis by analysis. I'm going to make a decision. We're going to move on it. And we're also going to use accountability, because once we move on it, we're going to see, hey, was that the right direction? Is this working? If it wasn't, we're going to make a different decision, right? Those are the best leaders. They buttress their decisiveness with accountability. And I think that's the best combination.
Question from the audience. How have women changed the game in SEAL world and or in the cultures of companies you've worked with?
Yeah, I see that from Tom, and I see Lewis also has one about G.I. Jane and women. So let's just talk about women in the SEAL teams. They are now allowed in the SEAL teams. Women are allowed. None of them, no woman has yet made it in. I don't think they've started training, or they've not made it through yet. I know there's a woman who made it through the Special Warfare Combatant Crewmen, the boat team folks, which is great. I'm someone, just to put it quite bluntly, who is really quite focused and about not becoming a dinosaur. Okay, and I think there's dinosaur ways of thinking, and the world evolves, and war evolves, and I think we are in a position now where we're heading towards a world where The next war is not going to be fought and won by muscles and guns. Okay, it's going to be fought and won by intelligence. It's going to be fought and won by nerds and by thinkers. Okay. Now, when we talk about any group of people that is exclusively one gender, okay, we are automatically missing out on 50% of the perspective. Okay, and you could do this. You could do a really easy experiment. Take a picture, just whatever, a portrait or a picture of a living room, for example, and show that to a guy and say, tell me what you see. And that guy's gonna be like, well, okay, I see a couch, I see a lamp, I see a carpet. Then show it to a lady and see what they say. It's gonna be a whole different explanation on that, okay? It's because women and men look at the world differently. And I'm someone who says, hey, if we're going to evolve our ability to defend our nation, to protect democracy, but to even do anything innovative and discovery inducing, we have to include all perspectives. So it means the community has to change. It has to morph. It's trying to. It's difficult. Again, some communities won't survive that type of evolution. They may have to just die on the vine and something new emerges. Who knows? But I'm all for that. I think. I mean, we don't. We're evolution creatures, and we are creatures that have made it from cave dwellers to space explorers, and we haven't done that by keeping our thinking the same. We've done that by opening our perspective. So all that to say, no women SEALs yet. They are allowed, so we'll see what happens. And I think it's a good move. There's gonna be some growing pains, and we'll see how that goes. But listen, my best friends now are are admirals, right? And guys I serve with are either master chiefs or out. But all of my best friends are now taking over this community at very high levels, and I couldn't be more comfortable. I mean, it's just I sleep so well at night knowing these guys have the watch. So we're in good hands. So just trust me.
That's great. I thought it was interesting that you mentioned that SEALs have fear of rejection. Please explain what are the pros and cons of fighting against and accepting rejection, because rejection is just a part of life.
So fear of rejection. So the fear of rejection attribute goes into that others category, that others chapter that I talk about. And it's really this idea that none of us like to look bad in front of the group, and we don't want to be isolated from the group. So what an elevated fear of rejection does for every one of us is it causes us to do things and perform in ways that we otherwise may have not. Okay, the example is, I'll use me as an example. Okay, I don't like heights. I've never liked heights. Okay, even though I love flying, right? But flying is different. So jumping out of airplanes was always difficult for me. Always, every single time I did it. The reason why I did it hundreds and hundreds of times was not because I was going to DZs on my own. It was because the guys next to me were doing it. And because they were going, there was no way I was not going to go, okay? Because I was not going to let them down, okay? So in a healthy, obviously fear of rejection in an healthy, any of these attributes, too much is bad and too little is bad, right? So there has to be a sweet spot. Obviously, fear of rejection too high can create peer pressure and things like that. But elevated levels like this cause people like me to do things I never would have otherwise done. It's because I'm not going to let this person next to me down. I'm not going to let them. I'm not going to be rejected by them. So that's why it's a little bit elevated for SEALs. But again, the opposite of that is insouciance. In other words, I don't care what other people think, and that's where a lot of the key iconoclasts come. They're just people who they just do their own thing, and they don't care what anybody thinks. And guess what? Suddenly people just start flocking to them. They just live their own lives. They are as important to society as sure. So again, this is why there's no judgment on either one. It's just like, okay, how do these show up? How does it manifest in my own life, and how can I maximize these capabilities?
Hey, Rich, talk about the leadership paradigms, because it was interesting. I never heard of this before, about the amoeba-shaped organizational plan, and what are the key attributes that you recommend in that plan? So explain a little bit about these different paradigms and what you came out with.
Yeah, so this was a result of me standing in front of a bunch of CEOs shortly after retirement, asking me to, on a whiteboard, draw what I thought the task organization looked like for a high performing team. And the models I had didn't fit. I had the hierarchical pyramid. Obviously, that wasn't going to work, because you have the leader who sits on top, says, hey, you work for me, and everything goes up and down in a very bureaucratic way. The flat model, which was like the flat line, which didn't also work because, again, sometimes it's in the flat model where they're like, oh, no one outranks anybody, everything's cool, right? Sometimes it's hard to actually figure out who's in charge, which is tough. But also in the flat model, things can be siloed, right? Something can happen on the right side of the line that doesn't happen on the left side. And then finally, there was the upside down pyramid, the servant leadership model, where the leader sits on the bottom. It's like, I'm your leader, but I work for you, right? That didn't work because in a high performing team, burden is distributed. So really, largely in frustration, I drew an amoeba, I drew a blob, and I said, where do you think the leader sits in this blob? And I got answers like front, back, top, bottom. I said, all of you are correct. In a high performing team, the leader is wherever the leader needs to be in the moment. Okay, this is called dynamic subordination. In a high performing team and dynamically subordinating team, people understand that the environment changes and challenges and issues can come from any angle at any moment. And when one does, the person who is closest to that problem and most capable immediately steps up and takes charge, and everybody follows. And then the environment shifts and someone else steps up, right? It's a constant swap. I also call it alpha swapping, that alpha position. This also speaks to the thing that, hey, leadership is not a position, right? It's a behavior. It's when do you step up? When do you recede? My hierarchical position, all that did as an officer in the teams is just define my roles in the teams. This is what I'm responsible for. So when it's my turn to step up, I'm stepping up, right? So dynamic subordination allows for this swap, constant swap. And that's exactly how the highest performed teams operate, certainly Navy SEALs. It's this dynamically subordinating environment.
Question from the audience. What's the best instruments to measure the 25 attributes? Is there a test out there that measures this?
Yes, right now we have an assessment tool on the website. We're going to be modifying it, making it even better, but you can go test your grit, mental acuity, and drive attributes. We have one coming out for the leadership and team ability. That's going to be a little bit more complex because, again, you don't get to call yourself a leader. You don't get to call yourself a great teammate. Other people decide whether or not you're either of those things. So those assessments are going to be 360 reviews, not just self-assessments, right? So, but we have those, at least the grit, mental acuity, and drive. We'll have the leadership and team ability out right after the new year, plus a revamped version of the single ones. So you can get a sense of those. And we're also putting together, this next year, we'll put together some processes to better help individuals figure out where they sit. We already have processes to help teams and organizations, but we're going to work on that. But right now there are some assessment tools. Just go to theattributes.com. You can check everything out there.
Excellent. Oh, you were able to buy that name, attributes.com?
Oh yeah, I did. I went in early.
You must went really early, like when the internet was starting. You write about narcissism. I would think that many of the world's greatest leaders and entrepreneurs are narcissists and have a high rating of that, yet incredibly successful. Well, one, is narcissism good, and how do you keep high potential narcissists from self-imploding?
Yeah, well, so narcissism was a great one to research. Again, just to kind of shorten this to the degree that we can, the elemental definition of narcissism is the desire to stand out, be adored, and be recognized. That's it. Okay, let me tell you something. Every single human being on this planet, at some point in their lives, wants to stand out, be adored, and be recognized. And this is neuroscientifically proven because you get neurochemicals, neurotransmitters released when you are getting adored. When an infant's getting paid attention to by their parents, they're getting dopamine, they're getting serotonin, they're getting oxytocin. Doesn't change when you're adults, okay? So narcissism at manageable levels can be and often is the impetus to some very audacious goals. Why the heck would someone want to be a Navy SEAL? People ask me that all the time. When I really dove in, sure, I was a patriot. Sure, I wanted to serve my country, but I wanted to see if I could be a badass. I wanted to see if I could do something that very few people could do. Then I asked my buddies, why did they become SEALs? They said the same thing. Okay, there's narcissism driving that to a small degree. The key is, so you don't get overboard, is surround yourself with trusted teams. Surround yourself with people who tell you the truth, even when it hurts, who keep you from getting out over your skis, who keep you humble, keep you laughing. And you can tell the malignant narcissist is always easy to spot because they surround themselves with yes men. And they are people who bend the knee, who are always telling what they want to hear. And oh, by the way, those positions are transient. So if someone leaves that group, that person becomes immediately enemy number one to that narcissist. That's just what happens. So malignant narcissism, you can always tell by the people who are surrounding that person. If we want to manage ourselves, we surround ourselves with people who tell us the truth. We trust. We're not always the center of attention. They keep us grounded. All that stuff.
So let's see if we can ask you two quick questions here. First is, when meeting someone who comes across as overly confident, how do you know if they're just hiding how inadequate they feel about themselves, or are they comfortable about themselves?
Well, the best way to do is experiential. That's why experiential environments are the best tool, because anybody can say anything in a interview process. But if you start to inflict some discomfort and some uncertainty, that's when these attributes start coming to the fore, without even asking for them. But so really so I always recommend to, in interview processes, if you can get experiential events in there, great. If you can ask some questions that insert some discomfort, some uncertainty, great, because that's when you can start seeing these attributes. And when you start seeing attributes, you are seeing the real person.
Last question. What skills are future leaders going to need to lead in a boundaryless world that we now are in, especially as Zoom has replaced the in-person interaction?
Yeah, I mean, we all need to work on becoming masters of uncertainty. It's not really about adjusting to the world. It's about adjusting to how the world changes. In other words, masters of uncertainty don't concern themselves with one specific environment. Masters of uncertainty concern themselves as, what are the tools and the techniques and the attributes I need so that regardless of the environment, whatever happens, I know how to manage. I think that's what we're endeavoring to do. Certainly what we're endeavoring to do at the Attributes Incorporated, and what I'm going to try to do here in the next few books, and kind of what I'm bent on after spending 21 years in teams of masters of uncertainty.
Right, exactly 1 o'clock. We thank you so much for taking the time. We will look forward to your next book. Everybody, it was wonderful seeing all of you. Everybody have a great and safe weekend.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Mark. Thanks for having me, and have a great weekend.